Hey everyone, I'm Olympic sailing coach Willie McBride, and I've been following along with the J70 National Championship that just wrapped up at my home club, Santa Barbara, this last weekend. And today I want to dig into the GPS tracks, I want to dig into the analytics, and I want to ask the question, how were the Nationals won? And what I think is really important here is that so often you get to the end of a big event like this and you're tired from so many days of racing, so many days of training in the lead up, and you might not have a chance to sit down and really do a thorough walkthrough of how did we perform and what are the lessons that we can take away from this event. And there aren't that many of these big championship events that allow you to kind of test those skills and to learn these lessons that can only come from racing against top competitors. So today I want to dig into that. I think that fortunately, when you have a fleet of GPS units on all the boats, you can really see what happened during racing and you can really learn from that. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the regatta and we're going to walk through kind of in the order of a race. So we're going to start with starts and then first beats and then downwind and so on. And what I hope you'll walk away from this with is a bit of a framework for how to think about racing, how to think about improving your racing, as well as some of the specifics of what the top teams were doing better than everybody else at this event. And if you were a top team, hopefully you walk away highlighting some of the places for yourself to make improvements. So let's go ahead and we'll start with starting. And what I want to pull up here is a bit of a scoreboard that looks at starting and it looks at your ranking in a couple different places around the race course. So of course, this ranking over here in the farthest left-hand column is the regatta ranking and how everyone did points-wise by the end of the regatta. But as we start to work our way right here, we have the starting ranking. So this was your average rank 60 seconds after the gun. Your escape ranking, so this is looking at 25% of the way up the beat, and then your first beat ranking. So where did you round that top mark on average? And what's interesting to see at this event is if we sort by starting here, I think that we see the Pacific Northwest fleet really crushed it on the starting line. So many of these teams in the top 10, when we sort by starting ranking, were teams that come from big fleets in Seattle in the Pacific Northwest, where they are racing against a lot of boats all the time, and they know how to start in dense fleets, and they know how to start when there's a lot of boats on the line. So let's go ahead and look at Pony was ranked number 1 in terms of starting. So let's go ahead and dig into some of their starts here. And what we can see, we'll go ahead and watch a couple of replays here. And one of the things that you'll notice is that Pony had really good starts, and they did that in large part by starting in the low density parts of the line. So in these races here that we're gonna watch, they start down close to the pin. And you can see that immediately off the line, if we watch the race progress here, you can see that they look quite good for the first big portion of the race, for the first 60 seconds off the line, and to a large extent, all the way to the 25% point of the race. Let's go ahead and we'll go back and we'll look at a couple more of their races. Here's their start in race 3. Again, starting down here at the pin in low density, and 60 seconds after the start, they're really punched in their section of the line. They're looking good against the boats on their hip. They're sailing fast. We'll look at one more. Let's go ahead and look at race 4. And again, a start down here, close to the pin. Very similar look, where they're punched relative to the boats around them and looking strong relative to the fleet. Okay, so let's go ahead and switch over now. And Odd was the boat that won the regatta. And, you know, if we watch their starts here, in race 1, they were ranked 1, 60 seconds off the line, and they started down at the biased end. They were the first to flop. And so 60 seconds off the line, here's what we look like, where we can look over our hip, we're beating the boats on our hip, we look down the course, and we're crossing everybody from that unbiased end down at the boat end. But as we got deeper into the regatta, what Odd started to do was they recognized that the right-hand side of the course was paying, which we'll look at in a second, and they shifted up the line, and they started starting at this boat end quite often. And at that boat end, they knew that a lot of these teams were competing for the right-hand side of the course, and so when those teams cleared out, they would clear out as well. And so even though their starting ranking may not have been as high, their escape from the line ranking was actually very high. So if we sort here, we'll collapse start, we'll sort by escape. We see that Pony had the best escapes from the line, so 25% of the way up the beat. They actually had the best ranking in the fleet, and Odd was right behind them. So Odd, although they were ranked 8th in terms of starting, 25% of the way up the beat now is ranked 2nd. And I think that a big reason for that is that they're starting oftentimes at an end of the line that is unfavored, but they're starting at the end that allows them to have access to the favored end. So if we look at the line in terms of how favored was each end, a really important question to ask is the favored end more important or the favored side of the course more important, especially on a race course like we saw so often here in Santa Barbara, where the pin was favored. So in race 1, we had 10 degrees of pin favor. In race 4, 2 degrees of pin, 5, 6, race 6, 5 degrees pin, race 7, 10 degrees pin. And over here, you can see how much that equates to if you were to start at the pin versus at the boat, or at the favored end versus the unfavored end. And so we're asking the question, is it more important to start at that favored end and take advantage of the bias? Or is it more important to start on the favored side, especially in those circumstances where the favored side is not necessarily the favored end? So let's go ahead and we're going to come in here to look at the starting line. And this is a scenario that we saw a lot during this regatta. And we'll go through a couple of different starts. But what we're looking at here is we're looking at this moment of the starting gun, or a couple moments after the starting gun. And this bar that we see, this kind of rainbow colored bar, shows you the density of boats on the line at various spots. So the thicker spots are the higher density spots on the starting line, and the thinner spots are the lower density spots where we had fewer boats starting and we potentially had an easier time getting off the line clean because we didn't have as much density. And what we can do is we can start to, over here with these sliders, we can drag these sliders, and right now the color scheme, the green versus red, shows you that in these green sections, these were the high percentage escapes where you had the best chance of being in the top 10 by 10% of the way up the first beat. But if what we want to actually look at is how likely were we to be in that top 10 25% of the way up the beat, we can drag this slider a little bit. And again, okay, we see that green portion kind of stays down towards the pin. And we can drag the slider even more and say, okay, what about 50% of the way up the beat? And now we see it start to kind of even out a little bit. We see that green color start to fade a little bit down here. And there start to be some pockets of green and some pockets of yellow, especially up here close to the boat. And as we get farther up the course, we see this blue line is telling us what's the ideal starting position if we want to be top 10 by, in this case, 81% of the way up the first beat. And we can see it just jumped up the line as we started looking farther and farther up the beat. And the reason for that in Santa Barbara was that this right-hand side of the course had more pressure, had more speed, and so often you had this density down at the boat end because those boats were fighting to get that lane that would take them to the right-hand side of the course. And the race committee knew that as well. So they were favoring the pin. They were trying to get people to come start down here near the pin end of the line. And we see that 25% of the way up the beat here, it was good to start down at that pin. But as we started to get farther up the beat, at some point that right-hand side starts to pay, and the boats who started down here at this right-hand side of the line were actually in position to take advantage of that right side paying. So if we wanted to be top 5 or top 4 by the top of the course, we really needed to start down here near the boat end. So let's go ahead and look at a couple of tips. If you're not getting off the line in that big fleet, like we talked about, if you're not used to starting in a big fleet, here are a couple quick things that you can do in practice by yourself that's going to make you much better at using your GPS, using your starting device to get off the line clean. So a couple things that I want to know is in each of these wind speeds, so 0 to 6 knots, 7 to 12 knots, 12 to 16, 17 to 23, in each of these wind speeds, what's your max burn rate? So that is how many meters can you burn if you're towards the line, if you're going as fast as you possibly can. So can you eat up 2 meters to the line in 1 second? What is your minimum creep rate? So that means if you're going the minimum speed and still having steerage, how few meters can you burn to get to the line? what is your minimum speed? So what you'll find is that if you're going 2 knots, you probably still have steerage, depending on the class of boat you're sailing, but maybe just barely. And so the question is, what is the minimum speed that you can sail and still have steerage? And you need to know that speed, because if you drop below that speed, you're in big trouble. And somebody needs to have an eye on the box all the time to tell you, hey, we're getting close, little speed on here. And then this is the more important piece. This is the piece that's really going to make a difference during racing, and this is knowing your trigger point. So in each of these wind speeds, your team should know how many meters are we looking to be at when we pull the trigger, and how many seconds do we need to have left when we pull the trigger. So in the J70, some rough rules of thumb that you might start with is in 0 to 6 knots, we want to be at 25 meters showing on the box with 25 seconds left to go. And in 7 to 12 knots, maybe we want to be at 18 meters with 10 seconds left to go. And we know we're going to be at full speed, and we know we're going to be approaching the line. Let's go ahead, and what I want to do is watch through a couple of starts here that Odd does. And one thing that I notice about their approach to the line is that they rarely are putting the bow down super hard at the end and trying to kill meters. They're rarely super bow high, trying to go high and slow, trying to kill meters at the end. They're usually having this nice approach to the line where they've timed the time and distance just right. They have some benchmarks that they know they need to stick to, and they're maybe putting the bow down at times to get speed on. They're putting the bow up at times to kill a little bit of speed. But at the end, they're trimming and they're going, and there's no big crazy moves at the end. And I think that comes down a lot to knowing your timed run. And so this is an example of a worksheet that I would do with a team that I think that you can talk through with your team. And this is actually for a different class of boat, so don't use these numbers. But here's the timed run that I like to do. It's a jibe at around 3:45, let's say, and crossing the line, shooting to cross the line at a known place around 3:30. You're going to sail straight for 60 seconds. You're going to jibe. That's probably going to take around 10 seconds. You're going to sail straight here for around 1:20. And then at the point that you tack, that means that you're tacking in a spot where you have about 1 minute left, and you're looking to be 80 meters from the line, which means that when you're down here doing this bottom run, you have 85 to 90 meters to the line. And if you know that each of these is kind of a benchmark, that this 330 is a benchmark, that this 85 to 90 meters is your benchmark down here, that you're going to be going for about 60 seconds, that it's going to take about 10 seconds to jibe. All of this allows you to just kind of check in as you're doing this whole lap. And you can tell, ooh, we're getting a little bit behind. We need to do our jibe a little earlier. Or we're a little bit too high in the box. We need to sail a little bit deeper. And if you practice this every single time, you'll get really good at that consistent approach to the line that Odd showed us there. Okay, on the starts, let's see. What I want to look at next is I want to look at the first upwind. So in terms of starts, that when we're on the starting line, we need to make a game plan. We need to talk about what our game plan is going to be. And I like to talk about 5 different types of day. There's connect the dots days, there's inside track days, there's outside track days, edge out days, and uncertain days. And I call it a type of day, but each race might actually be a different type of day. In this case, so many of the races this weekend in Santa Barbara were these outside track, place to race to, geographic dominant feature, and maybe there was some current difference on the inside, or maybe a little bit more pressure on the right-hand side. But one way or another, so many of the races ended up being this outside track race course where the right-hand side continued to pay. And so let's look at what that actually looks like. On the first beat, I think it's really important for every team to articulate both your plan A and your plan B. So what do I mean by that? Your plan A is what you do if you get off the line clean and you have good speed and you're able to do whatever you want. So this shot here is a shot of 3 big dogs in race 2, just absolutely crushed it. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. So here's that start. And we've got big dogs down here circled in purple. I'm gonna go ahead and actually rewind, play that back. They get a nice start down here at the boat end. In race 2, the boat was favored by 9 degrees, I believe. Yep, 9 degrees of boat favor. They take that early escape to the right-hand side. And pretty early on, they start jumping out to a lead. We can see speed here. They're getting nice pressure out on this right-hand side. And then a big, nice little lift that kind of shears them up to the boats above them. And so often in Santa Barbara, you see this happen. Maybe it's a lift, maybe it's a little bit of current relief over there, but either way, they're going super, super fast over here. And we'll go ahead and speed it up now. But by the time they tack and cross, oops, they're miles ahead of everyone. And I think that this is, to me, this is what plan A looks like. This is what plan A feels like. You can do whatever you want. So plan A in this regatta so often, to me, was this outside right racetrack. Find an early lane on port and sail fast towards the right. So let's look at another plan A race. And this is following odd this time. And we see that off the line, they're kind of locked up. They've started up here close to the boat end. It's a little bit pin favored in this case, but not enough to make that difference that we looked at earlier. And odd is very patient in just waiting for their spot to take their lane on port to that right-hand side of the course and get into this drag race. And they know, hey, it's okay if there's boats to the right of us who kind of lead us into that side. We're gonna be able to hang all the way out there. They've picked this really nice big lane, whereas you can see some of these boats to leeward of them know that they're racing to this right-hand side of the course, but immediately, as soon as the boat on their hip tacks, they tack, and they have these really small lanes, and that makes it way harder for them to go fast this whole time. It doesn't give them as many options in terms of what modes they can sail. So I think one of the things that odd does really nicely is they're patient, they wait for their spot, but their plan A is, hey, we want to go to the right, and they take a nice big lane that can allow them to get there. All right. Let's talk about plan B, because so often you don't get plan A starts. And so what I want to look at next is, what does it look like when you don't get off the line and when you have to kind of take this plan B start? So we're going to go ahead and follow Crester down here. And one of the things that actually I'll show you here, let me pull this up right now. Looking at the starts versus the escapes, actually the escape versus the first beat. I think that, to me, one of the biggest metrics that jumps out to me in the fleet here is Crester did an amazing job at this regatta of converting, pretty deep escapes, 25% of the way up the beat, to really good top mark roundings all the way at the top. And so I think this next segment is a really good example of how they did that and what they did to make those escapes happen. So what we can see is off the line here at the boat end, they don't have a great acceleration. They don't get off the line super clean, and they are forced to make this hard decision early on. Do we go straight and wait for clear air for our nice lane that we just saw odd take that puts them in a spot to have a big, fat, clean air lane all the way to the right? Or do we take this plan B lane that they end up taking? And that plan B lane, in their case, is this thin lane in not, maybe not great air. But what they see is that in order for us to get to clear air, if we were to go straight here, we would have to end up to the left of the whole fleet anyways. And so we would give away the entire advantage of this right-hand side. Look at this speed difference off the line right here. I mean, I think this is a pretty huge illustration of everybody down here on the right-hand side, including Crester, who is second row off the line, is sailing super, super fast. And everybody down here has these blued tails and going much slower. And so what we can see, we have these little rainbow streaks that you can see are passes. And what they tell you is that when you see a green part of the rainbow, that means that that boat is in the process of passing someone on the other side of the race course. And you see a lot of green down on this right-hand side of the course. And that was the case so often here in Santa Barbara for exactly this reason, because there's more speed on this right-hand side of the course. There's less speed over here on the left-hand side. And what Crester did such a good job of in executing these Plan B escapes was first picking that kind of, we call it the lane you deserve. It's the lane that maybe it's not the best lane, but it's the lane that someone in your position can expect to have and sail the same speed as other people who are in positions near you. And if you get greedy and try to take a lane that's better than you deserve, then someone's going to tack on you. And now all of a sudden you're in this spot where you're in bad air. And so if we play this race out, even though it was a second row start, these guys do a great job of sailing fast, of sailing on the favored side. Whoops, that was a GPS dropout. and they end up rounding the windward mark in a really nice position. Okay, we're going to go ahead and stop there because sometimes the Vaqueros loses GPS. So let's go ahead and look at that lane you deserve one more time in one other context. And this is, we're going to go ahead and look at race 6, and we're going to look at odd, and we're going to look at, we're going to look at odd, and we're going to look at dime. And we'll go ahead and back it up here. And both of these teams in this last race of the regatta have great starts. They both do exactly what we've talked about in getting off the line in this plan A lane. You can see that both of them have taken nice fat lanes. Look at the distance between odd and the boat to leeward, and dime and the track to leeward. Both of those are much bigger than the lanes of the boats around them. And that allows them to go super fast up this first beat. And so as we watch this play out, I'm going to go ahead and turn this back to speed. As we watch this play out, dime comes back, and they're actually pretty much bow to bow with odd. They're in a spot where, at this point, they're leading the race. And they've taken a lane that is just shy of leyline to the weather mark. And what we'll see here is that odd hips up, takes a spot farther to the right, which we know is favored. We know there's more speed on that right-hand side of the course. And so as the boats who are first and second in this race, the lane you deserve is slightly different than what we talked about before, right? If you're second row, the lane you deserve is kind of a compromised lane. But if you're first or second, you can take the lane that puts you exactly on ley line, and that forces everybody else to kind of form to your lane, right? Because if you're first, someone can't come in and they can't tack to leeward, they can't tack inside. And I think what odd does such a great job of right here is calling that lane you deserve as being, okay, that's bang on ley line here, and dime is just shy of maybe that lane that they deserve because they were winning at that first cross, and odd gets that little edge of a little extra pressure on the right, doesn't have to do those 2 tacks at the end, and ends up rounding that top mark in first. And so I think that was a really big factor in the racing this weekend, is knowing that lane you deserve. So let me give you another tool that any team can use, and this is part of the homework that every team should be doing. I think that what we've just talked about is we've talked about the escape from the line. How do we exit the line, and how do we find that lane onto port, that first lane onto port, your plan A or your plan B lane onto port? How do we execute the plan? So in this case, we said our plan was the outside right track. And how do you execute that plan? How do you get over there to the right-hand side? And what we're starting to talk about in this lane you deserve and watching that race 7 approach to the windward mark is that top third of the beat, the approach to the windward mark. And this is a sheet that, again, this is something I made with a different class of boat, as you can tell by the full foiling mode. But, I think that this is something that can really help you organize your thoughts, organize your communications. So everything in quotes here is communication that I want the skipper to have, or that I want the crew to have at this part of the line. This is the question that we're asking at each section on the race course. And if you lay your thoughts out like this, what are we thinking about before the start? What are we thinking about in the first third of the beat? What are we thinking about in the second third of the beat? And what are we thinking about in the third third of the beat? That's really going to help your whole team focus on and communicate about the factors that make the difference in the end. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the weather mark approach. And what we're going to look at here is we're looking at race 6, and we're looking at these boats that are circled in purple. And these boats are the top movers for this race. So essentially, they're the boats that gained the most of anyone in this final approach to the top mark. And what I want to look at, so here they are going up this first beat. Whoops, I'm going to go ahead and pause and rotate the map around. Oh, computer's getting a little slow here. So what I want to look at is the fact that so many of these boats that are mid-fleet are the boats that are moving forwards in the fleet in this last little bit into the windward mark. And the way they do it when they're in the middle of the fleet is often by calling a shy ley line where they can approach the mark, not on ley line, not overstood like in this pack up here, but underneath ley line, where there's a little bit less traffic. Because you can see, one of the things that you can see is that if we sight down the ley line here, whoops, my computer's just being a little bit laggy right now, but if we sight down the ley line here, we can see this whole pack is way overstood. And the reason for that is kind of this lane you deserve. These boats in the lead tack on ley line. And so if you're the second boat, well, if you want to get to ley line, you're going to hip up on them. And if you're the third boat, you're hipping up on them. If you're the fourth boat, all of a sudden, you start to get this pack that's way overstood. And yeah, they're going fast because they're reaching at the end. But so many of these purple boats, these boats circled in purple, who passed a lot of boats in the final third of the beat, are these boats who tack shy on ley line and who take two later on in this upwind and are able to kind of sneak into these sneaky spots where they can get in amongst the fleet, and they don't overstand by a lot, and they don't have to sail in the bad air of this pack approaching that windward beat. So this shy lane into the top mark, so often when you're in the middle of the fleet, is the move that allows you to pass boats and to get back up into the fleet. Okay, so we're gonna talk about downwinds next. And I first need to explain one of the terms that I'm going to use, and I'm going to talk a lot about the diamond. So the downwind diamond is something that I like to think about as being kind of whoops, let me make that red, as being I'll make it a little thicker. Okay, so it's this outside part of the course downwind of kind of the ley lines, and then on the next leg, on the next jibe, it's here. And then on the other side of the course, we have one here. And on the top, we have one here. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the diamond. And there's a couple of rules of thumb that are super simple downwind rules that when in doubt, you should stick to. So the first rule of thumb downwind is that the outsides of the diamond on the top and the insides of the diamond on the bottom end up paying because you stay in clear air. So what I mean by that is that if you're straight setting, you want to straight set into a high lane, because if you straight set into a low lane and boats are able to kind of work high on you, you're going to be in a threatened position where oftentimes you're in bad air. And so the high lane of this straight set, or if you're going to do the jibe set, we talk about a tactical move that is the double wide. So that's the wide and tight at the mark. And that if you go wide early and wide as you round the mark, and then as you're getting around that bottom edge of the mark, the leeward side of the mark, that's when you want to be able to reach out and touch the mark. Because if you can put yourself in that lane, nobody's going to be able to go over the top. And we'll look at that in a second. And then the second rule of thumb is sail the long jibe first. And we'll get into that in just a minute. But this is, if there was one spot in the regatta where Odd was at risk of kind of having their championship approach fall apart, it was the first downwind of the second race of the regatta. And so I want to look at that, and I want to look at some of these rules of thumb from that standpoint. And so this will restart in just a second. So here we are at the top mark, and we'll pause here. The highlighted boat here is Odd, and they've rounded that top mark in 8th or 9th. And they've done a really nice job of doing that double wide rounding that I was just talking about, where they went wide and super tight. And you can see that they're in this high lane after the jibe set, and nobody's going to be able to get above them if they defend, right? And in contrast, you have some other boats who do the jibe set back here, but they're kind of in a low lane, or this kind of red kite here you can see is kind of in a low lane, and they're at risk now of having the train roll over the top of them. So that double wide move really puts you in a spot where you can hang pretty much all the way down the course. And Odd puts themselves in that position nicely. They're in 8th as they come around, or 9th, 10th. And now what they do is they end up taking this early jibe. And they kind of take two here that puts them in now the low road, and they have the fleet over top that's probably casting some bad air. And certainly if Odd goes faster than this pack here, they're going to sail up into bad air. And so the question, looking from the boat upwind, is where is our apparent wind here? Is it coming from in front of us or a beam of us, or is it coming from behind? And, I think that basically they are in this really tough position now where they have this narrow window to keep their air clear behind that pack here. And when we look over here, we have another pack that's down to leeward. So we're kind of in no man's land in the middle of the course. We're not on the inside of the diamond on the bottom of the course. And as we play it out, what ends up happening is they kind of end up sandwiched in the middle here, right? And so you can see they're on a ladder rung with a lot of traffic, and there's a lot of traffic to the left, and there's a lot of traffic to the right. And so they're still in 10th, but with a lot of boats kind of even, a beam of them coming into this leeward mark. And it ends up being that leeward mark rounding where they kind of have to take two. They fight their way towards this left-hand turn. and have to round behind quite a lot of those boats, get a little bit pinwheeled here, and end up end up about 18th around that leeward mark right here. So let's go ahead, and here's a tool that I think can be helpful when you're thinking about that approach to the gate. This is something that I call the decision diamond. And what we look at is if you straight set, if you go all the way to ley line to the far ley line to the nearest gate, or the nearest ley line to the farthest gate, these are parts of our decision diamond. And if you jibe it 70% of the way to ley line, this is the top of our decision diamond. And so I like to think about this diamond as being the place where you need to make a decision about which gate you're going to go to. And if you're the leaders, it's good to go on ley line, on this near ley line to the far gate, because it gives you the option to, at the end, make a decision of, I'm going to go left-hand turn or I'm going to go right-hand turn. You still have the option if you go on this ley line. If you go all the way to the far ley line to the near gate, or if you jibe set to the far ley line to the near gate, either of these put you in a spot where you're committed. And if you get most of the way down that run and you're like, ooh, actually the other one looks favored, or there's been a wind shift and actually the other one's favored now, you can't take advantage of it. Whereas if you put yourself right at the bottom of this decision diamond, you can go either turn. Now, the problem with that is that if the fleet is dense, if the fleet is tight, and you end up kind of in the middle here, this is where odd ends up sort of being in that gate mark that we just looked at. And when you're in that spot, it's really hard to get back to a place where you're not going to get pinwheeled, where you don't have boats inside of you. So if you're in traffic, hit the top of the decision diamond. Get to the top of the decision diamond, make a decision, do I go left turn or right turn? And then fight hard to get to one of these red circles, depending on whether you're going left turn or right turn. If you're winning the race, and if you're not in a lot of traffic, if you're alone, then hit the bottom of the decision diamond, because it'll just be extra distance and it'll be easier to, or it'll be less distance and it'll be easier to call which of these gate marks you want to do. So hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that's some language that you can use with your team that helps you approach those gates in a better way. And what I want to look at is two examples of, so I want to look at one example of how the gate was a passing opportunity for the top teams. What we just talked about, that decision diamond, is something that I think is really important for the back of the fleet and or the middle of the fleet even. And what we're looking at over here on the right, these numbers are pulled from our rankings. And this is how many boats a team passed over the course of a regatta. So how many points you could add to your score over the course of a regatta, or how many points you could take away from your score over the course of a regatta, depending on how you played that gate. And what we see is that it's actually a much more of the fleet lost big numbers than gained big numbers. So if you did it poorly, you lost a lot more than if you did it well, than you gained if you did it well. So hopefully that decision diamond will help you to clean these big numbers up and keep it somewhere that's a little bit more moderated. Okay, so let's look at how the gate was a passing opportunity for the top teams. And again, when we're asking this question of how was the Nationals won, when you were in the top group, after the first day or so, there were 6 teams who were quite punched on the fleet. But they were really tight amongst themselves. Those 6 teams were kind of tied together. And when you were part of that group, this gate, there were not many passing opportunities, but this gate was one of those passing opportunities. So let's go ahead and look at what that looks like. And we're going to use this example. We have a couple of teams selected here. We're going to look at Mossy, we're going to look at Odd, DJ, and Crester as they come around the marks here. And on the left here, we have Odd rounding first and Crester rounding second. On the right of our screen here, we have Mossy rounding first and DJ rounding second. And around this gate, if we sort of align the screen so that the boats exiting the mark are sort of exiting on equal angles, what we can see is that right-hand turn, the mark on the left-hand side of our screen, or the left-hand side, was a little bit farther upwind, so a little bit favored. And this left-hand turn was a little bit unfavored. And more importantly, I think, we had the fleet coming into this mark, and this was one of those races where the downwind was a little bit skewed. We had a lot of people jibe set, and so we have quite a bit of the fleet here on this ley line, so that the boats who've done this left-hand turn end up sailing in bad air for a lot of that time. And what we see is that this ends up being a pretty big gainer for the boats who go right-hand turn, even though it takes you away from the favored side of the course. that mark is favored, and both of those boats end up rounding both of the boats who go left-hand turn and sail under the bad air towards the favored side of the course. All right, cool. So we're getting towards the end here. At this point, once you've gotten around that gate, there was very little passing left to be had in the races. And we can look at that in the numbers, but, I think that the main thing that I would look at is on the second beats, in that top group especially, the leaders rarely gained more than one position on that second beat. So the priority is don't lose boats. The priority is make sure that you lock in what you have and that you play a little bit of defense and that you close the race up nicely. Because if you can keep it neutral or positive, then on average, maybe you pass a couple boats over the course of the regatta on that second beat. If you ever lose boats, now it becomes really hard to keep your average passing rate positive. So on the second beat, my biggest takeaway from watching all these races through and debriefing all of them is that you needed to keep your average delta positive on the second beat, and you did that by minimizing leverage with the people around you who you were racing against. And the final run was a very similar thing. Very little passing, stick to those downwind rules of thumb that we talked about earlier. And so the one that we didn't look at earlier is this idea of sail the long jibe first. And so this is an example of that. This is race 2. And in race 2, what we saw was that in a couple of races, actually, the downwind ended up being fairly skewed and everybody was jibe setting. And as a result, if you didn't jibe set, or if you had kind of a wide and wide and wide, which there is a time for that tactical move, but if you ended up being in a low lane out of the jibe set, it was actually a really bad spot to be because you likely were in bad air from boats in front of you. And even if you weren't, if you happen to get a nice puff from behind and you start closing down with boats in front of you, well, they're all of a sudden a roadblock. Whereas if you're in the high lane and you're on that long jibe, then you have a long time to pick your shift. You have clear air all the way down. And it's not until you get down into this bottom part where you get to the decision diamond, and that's where you have to start making some decisions. So playing that long jibe first and making sure that you keep yourself in a spot where you have clear air all the way down the course was a good idea on that final run. And, one of the reasons there's very little passing is that the fleet is way more spread out by the time we get to this last leg of the race. And so my final note was that occasionally there's maybe an opportunity for some match racing moves there on that last downwind. That's because the fleet is spread out. And so if you don't have anybody close and it's just a one-on-one battle, thinking about, okay, how do I use bad air, use some match race moves to make one more pass on this race could be an option if the opportunity presents itself. But in general, keeping it tight, staying on the long jibe first was the high percentage move on that final run, and there was very little passing. So that's kind of all I've got. Odd did an amazing job sailing a super consistent series. They threw out their race 2 and they won with a very convincing scoreline. And it was really fun to follow the races for everybody else in the fleet. I think that it was awesome to see so many boats fighting it out, such a tight little group in that top 6. I think that there was supposed to be an 8th race that was scheduled for that last day, and going into that last race, it looked like it was going to be exciting all the way into the end. And so it was a fun race to follow, and hopefully you guys all learned a lot. My final thoughts to sum this up are you don't get very many opportunities to race in a national championship or any kind of a championship level setting. And that means you don't get that many reps to really learn from the decisions that you're making. So you need to dig into the tracks, dig into the information that you have available to you. I think this is the best way to learn and to improve your tactics and strategy. The second tip that I have is read books. This is my little ebook, and it's not that little, but it is an audiobook, it's an ebook. It talks about a lot of the concepts that I've talked about here today, and hopefully that can be useful and interesting and something to stimulate thought and discussion and progress on your team. And the final thing, my final and probably biggest suggestion is do your homework with your team, whether that is looking at the tracks, whether that is using some of these templates that I've laid out in this debrief to talk about how you're gonna have better conversations on the boat, better communication, how you're gonna talk about the race course. It's so valuable to sit down with your team ahead of time over dinner or breakfast or whatever it is and walk through these tools and just continue to improve your systems, continue to do your homework, and make sure that you show up to your next championship regatta with those things dialed in and ready to go and ready to test. And that way, when you go back and look at the GPS tracks, you can see where you succeeded and where you failed and where you need to, study more. So hopefully that's helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. My email is Willie, W-I-L-L-I-E, at mcbrideracing.com, or you can contact me through my website, mcbrideracing.com. And I look forward to seeing you all on the water soon.